Okay, let's get started. Welcome, all of you, on behalf of public programs at CUNY Graduate Center. My name's Claire Bishop. I'm a professor in the Ph.D. program in art history, and I'm very happy to be introducing this event. Just a quick word about the Graduate Center, for those of you who don't already know. It's CUNY's hub for doctoral education. It has over 50 doctoral and master's programs, and over 30 centers and institutes of advanced research. We're a public graduate school, and central to our mission is bringing new knowledge to the city's publics. The PhD program in art history is one of the Grad Center's flagship departments. So tonight we have a chance to hear from one of our leading scholars in the department, Professor Amanda Wunder, who's also a dear colleague. Like many faculty at the Graduate Center, Amanda also teaches at one of CUNY's other colleges, in this case Lehman College in the Bronx, where she's a professor in the history department. She's also, I think, a newly minted curator, and I strongly recommend a visit to her exhibition at the Hispanic Society, which opened last month and which runs through March next year, and it's called Spanish Style Fashion Illuminated 1550 to 1700. So tonight, Amanda will be speaking about her award-winning book, Spanish Fashion in the Age of Velázquez, published last year by Yale University Press. We don't have copies available to buy now, but you can buy them online in English or in Spanish. It's already been showered with accolades, winning the Renaissance Society of America Prize for the Best Book in Renaissance Studies and the American Historical Association Award for, bear with this quote, the most outstanding work published in English on any aspect of 17th and 18th century European history. The book was recently featured in Spanish Vogue, which compared 17th century Spanish fashion to upcoming spring collections by Dior, Carolina Herrera, and Simone Rocha, among others. Now, one change in tonight's program, it was billed as being a conversation between Amanda Wunder and Jonquil O'Reilly, the head of Old Masters at Christie's. Very sadly, Jonquil is ill and can't attend, so Amanda will be speaking as a solo act. She'll talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a short window for Q&A. And during that period, please come up to the microphones on either side to ask your questions. Okay, I think you're in for a great evening. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Wunder.
Well, thank you so much, Claire, for this introduction and for being such a spectacular colleague. Also, huge thanks to Karen Sander, who organized this event, and to all of the people behind the scenes who have done everything possible to make this run so smoothly, from the lights to the audiovisual to checking everyone in. I really appreciate all of your work on this. And an extraordinary thanks to the audience members who did not get up and walk out when Claire announced that Jonquil couldn't be here. I'm so glad that you stayed. This would have been a much more fun and interesting event had Jonquil been able to join us, but I promise I will do my best as a solo act, as Claire put it. I'm especially sort of moved to be presenting this work here in the physical space of the Graduate Center, because this is where I wrote the book, in my office on the third floor, primarily during those really bleak months of the COVID lockdown and afterwards. The Graduate Center is a really extraordinary place that creates the literal space, but also the conversational space and the intellectual space for people to do their best work. And not only that, what's really special about the Graduate Center is it is part of its mission to get it out to the public, which was what makes it so exciting for me to be able to talk to you about this book here tonight. So thank you all for being here. Now, as my book cover clearly shows, Spanish fashion in the Age of Velázquez was not exactly subtle. 17th century court clothes were totally over the top in every way. They were incredibly expensive, outrageously proportioned, and by all accounts, they were terribly uncomfortable. We know about them today primarily thanks to court portraits painted by Diego Velázquez, who included his own self-portrait standing at his easel in his masterpiece, Las Meninas. The Meninas are the two young girls from aristocratic families who attend to the young girl at the center of the painting. This is King Philip IV's youngest daughter, the Infanta Margarita, who wears a dress as wide as she is tall. The man who designed Margarita's clothes and invented the Spanish look that's so well known thanks to this painting was a court tailor named Mateo Aguado, who's the subject of my book. Aguado served as the head tailor in the Queen's household for 42 years, from 1630 until 1672. Over these decades, Aguado dressed 2 queens of Spain and all of their children. We've already met the Infanta Margarita, and during this talk, we'll also get to know the Queen's other major patrons, Aguado's other major patrons. As the man who dressed the Queen and her household, Aguado was the most influential fashion designer in the 17th century Spanish world, not just at the court in Madrid, but throughout all of Spain and its global territories. Now, not a single one of Aguado's creations survives today, as far as we know, and I'll share some of the reasons why this is the case over the course of this talk. But the memory of Aguado's work has been preserved and passed down for generations, largely thanks to Velázquez's court portraits. Aguado's dress designs have influenced and inspired artists and designers from the 17th century up to the present day, but the tailor himself was totally forgotten for about 3.5 centuries. This wasn't for lack of documentation. At the Royal Palace Archive in Madrid, there are about 900 pages of annual account records listing every garment that Aguado made and the fabrics and trimmings that he used. And actually, when COVID struck, I had these documents on PDFs, and I had tickets to go to Madrid and go back and do my favorite thing, which is to run around and go to museums and go to libraries. But thanks to the lockdown, I had to actually sit in my chair and read the documents, and that's how I ended up with this book. Now, looking at this page, you're going to see numbers in the left and right-hand margins. The figures on the right represent the amount that Aguado claimed each piece was worth. The much smaller number on the left are what the crown actually paid him, about 75%. At first glance, Aguado's accounts are incredibly tedious. Well, at first glance, they're absolutely impossible to read. But once you get past that, what you find are these incredibly boring, repetitive lists of everything that he made. But hidden in these lists, there are fascinating details about the clothes and their construction, about the people who wore them, and the life of the man who made them. Aguado's years of working at the Spanish court coincided about exactly with those of Diego Velázquez, King Philip IV's favorite painter. Velázquez became famous in his own lifetime for the way he managed to evoke rich court costumes by applying daubs of paint that only resolve into a legible picture from a distance. Velázquez is undoubtedly a spectacular painter, but for those of us who want to know about the details of his sitters' clothes and accessories, he's an immensely frustrating artist. Note here in his portrait of Philip IV how Velázquez skipped over the details of the king's intricate lace collar and how the silver decorations on the jacket, sleeves, and sash all jumble together in an indecipherable tangle. By contrast, lesser artists contemporary with Velázquez represented the details of dress much more literally. Note here how the unknown artist who painted this portrait of Mariana of Austria, Philip IV's second wife, carefully delineated the queen's fine scalloped-edged lace collar and the silver button and loop decorations on her dress and sleeves. And this painting, by the way, is on display right now at the Hispanic Society at the exhibition that Claire mentioned. So, in order to interpret Aguado's accounts, I relied heavily on Velázquez's portraits in combination with much more obscure portraits by less accomplished artists in order to decipher what Velázquez was trying to say. As I've already mentioned, very few secular garments from this period survive, but there are plenty of textile fragments in museum collections, which I used in the book to help recreate Aguado's work. Now, when it comes to Aguado's personal life, there's abundant documentation in Madrid's notarial archive, including several versions of the tailor's last will and testament and a lengthy posthumous inventory of all of his possessions. I also made a pilgrimage to the municipal archive of the village where Aguado was born, and at the very final hour when the book was already in proofs, I finally gained access to the tailor's parish archive in Madrid, and there I found the documentation that I needed to piece together his rather complicated family tree. So in short, to reconstruct the life and work of this forgotten tailor, Mateo Aguado, I did all the things that you would do to investigate an important historical figure, someone like Velázquez. And as it turned out, there was an enormous amount of information about this once anonymous artisan. And so now I'd like to share with you what I learned. Our story begins in the year 1605 in Fuenlabrada, a village of some 1,300 residents located 12 miles southwest of Madrid. This is where Mateo Aguado was born. According to a survey of the village around this time, everyone in Fuenlabrada was poor. Most of the men there worked as manual laborers, which is probably how Mateo Aguado's father earned a living. Aguado's mother shared a surname with the village tailor and several weavers. I suspect that this is how Mateo Aguado came to enter the tailoring profession. Aguado moved to Madrid when he was about 6 years old, around the year 1611. This was a time of massive migration to the Spanish capital. The royal court had recently returned to Madrid from Valladolid, which created great demand for new clothes to dress the royal family and to outfit the many courtiers who followed them, the servants who worked at the palace, the actors and actresses who performed in the theaters, and the priests who said Mass in Madrid's many churches, among many others. There was no shortage of work in Madrid for skilled craftsmen and women, including weavers, embroiderers, tailors, and the rough setters who made the enormous collars that were worn by the elites at this time. And here you see a very rare portrait of an embroiderer, a remarkably well-dressed one. Many of the embroiderers, tailors, and other artisans worked in the parish of San Ginés, the garment district of 17th century Madrid. The church of San Ginés still stands there today. As a boy, Mateo Aguado settled into this neighborhood where he grew up, surrounded by fabric shops like the one depicted here. Aguado continued to live in the parish of San Ginés for the rest of his life. Aguado was probably about 13 years old when he began his formal study as an apprentice under a master tailor. There was a strict hierarchy in the tailoring profession. On the one side, there were the master tailors who had passed the guild exam and had the privilege of cutting out fabric. In this picture of a tailor's workshop, the master tailor is the one standing at the cutting table, compass and rule in hand. And then there were the journeyman tailors who had not yet taken the exam, like the men seated in this picture. They worked for a daily wage, stitching garments together and sewing on their trimmings. Most tailors in Madrid struggled to earn a living, but a select few who were fortunate enough to work at the court did incredibly well for themselves. In the early 1600s, the richest tailor by far was Francisco de Soria, who was the head tailor for the household of Queen Margaret of Austria. Here we can appreciate Soria's handiwork in a portrait of the queen wearing a formal dress made from a rich fabric that's probably stamped satin, similar to this. Soria also dressed the next queen, Isabella of Bourbon, here modeling a dress made from a spectacular patterned velvet, which is identical to this surviving fragment. Looking at these sumptuous fabrics, we can understand why only a master tailor was permitted to cut them. Mateo Aguado entered Francisco de Soria's workshop at some point in the 1620s, probably starting off as one of the dozens of journeyman tailors who carried out Soria's orders. While countless artisans labored on the queen's wardrobe, only one could hold the position of sastre de cámara, the tailor of the chamber. Francisco de Soria did extremely well for himself in this role. He and his wife lived in a grand home on the Calle Mayor in the neighborhood of San Ginés, where he also owned numerous rental properties. Soria had accumulated quite a fortune by the time he died in October of 1630. Royal artisans often passed their lucrative court jobs down to their heirs, but Soria and his wife had no children. This meant that the position of tailor to the queen was open for the first time in 3 decades. Queen Isabel chose Mateo Aguado for the job. So at 25 years old, the villager from Fuenlabrada was sworn in as tailor to the queen. Being a royal tailor was a round-the-clock job. The Queen's tailor had many responsibilities. In addition to dressing the Queen herself, he also dressed the royal children, and he made gifts of clothing for household employees, court entertainers, visiting dignitaries, and religious sculptures of the Virgin Mary and Christ child. He even made clothes for the Infanta's dolls and for the prince's toy soldiers. Aguado was always on call, and it wasn't at all unusual for him to be woken up at midnight and told to sew 360 buttons onto an outfit for the prince to wear the next day. On the eve of major holidays, Aguado and his workshop stayed up all night, making a dress for the Queen to wear the next day. There could be a dozen journeyman tailors and up to 50 seamstresses working on a single garment. These holiday dresses must have been made with long stitches that were quick to sew and just as easy to rip out after the event had concluded, so that the precious fabrics could be reused. This offers one clue as to why court dresses from this period don't survive today. Aguado's accounts also reveal that he was sometimes paid to make preparatory drawings of the decorations that he designed. Aguado's drawings haven't survived, or at least they haven't been found, but we can see the ornaments that he designed in Velázquez's paintings, like this portrait of the young prince, Baltasar Carlos, who wears an outfit richly trimmed with curls of gold. The fact that Aguado made such drawings and was compensated for them is quite significant. This reveals that Aguado wasn't just a tailor, he was a designer, and his patrons valued his original work. Now, the ornaments on clothes worn by the Spanish royal family weren't merely decorative, they were also political. Dress decorations conveyed the crown's wealth and prestige, of course, but they could also communicate very specific political messages to their subjects and to foreign powers. This was especially true for royal women, who were seen more often than they were heard. Aguado's primary patron, Queen Isabella Bourbon, played a very active role in the making of her wardrobe. Fabrics were woven specifically to her taste, and she was very particular about the details of her dresses, sending finished garments back to Aguado if she didn't like the buttons he had used, or if she wanted a different colored lining. So when Mateo Aguado introduced novelties into Queen Isabella's wardrobe, this had to be with the Queen's explicit approval. In the mid-1630s, Aguado began to use military-style decorations on the Queen's dresses, in particular, slashing the fabric to reveal a rich layer of contrasting fabric beneath, and applying hundreds of decorative buttons and loops called alamares, which were worn by Spanish soldiers, like the ones you see here. Aguado was militarizing the Queen's dresses at a very sensitive moment, just as war broke out between Spain and France. Queen Isabel was French by birth, and her brother was the King of France, which put her in an awkward position with her Spanish subjects. But she won their favor and acquired a reputation as a fierce defender of Spain, a reputation that her tailor helped to shape with his dresses. This strong image of Queen Isabel and of Aguado's dresses circulated outside of Spain in portraits like this one, which was sent to the Austrian court at Vienna. In this portrait, the Queen's dress is made from a brown silk decorated with silver rings. In 1639, Mateo Aguado made a dress for the Queen out of a fabric just like this, which had been a gift to the Queen from her son, Prince Baltasar Carlos. The following year, in 1640, Aguado used the train of that dress to make a little dress for Queen Isabel's 2-year-old daughter, the Infanta Maria Teresa. This is another reason why court dresses from this time don't survive today. The fabrics were so precious that they were repurposed and reused over and over again until there was nothing left. Queen Isabel died unexpectedly at the age of 41. Mateo Aguado continued to work at the palace, now serving as tailor to the Infanta Maria Teresa, who had become the head of her own household at age 6. Aguado dressed Maria Teresa exclusively in black after her mother's death, but after a year of mourning, the Infanta's tailor began to incorporate a little bit of color and sparkle into her wardrobe. For example, in January of 1646, Aguado made a dress from black velvet embroidered with silver squares, an unusual fabric that had been a gift to the Infanta from her former governess, the Countess of Olivares. This is almost certainly the dress that we see in Maria Theresa's portrait at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The archival documentation that I found definitively dates the painting, and it also tells us something new, that this portrait commemorates a gift of special fabric. This is a good moment, I think, to point out that clothes were worth far more than paintings at this time. The Queen's tailor earned about twice as much for making a dress as Velázquez earned for painting a full-length portrait, and that doesn't even include the cost of the dress's materials and trimmings. Mateo Aguado had a new queen to dress after Philip IV remarried, this time to the Archduchess Mariana of Austria, who was the king's niece. She was 15 years old, while Philip was 44. I'll let that sink in for a second. In the summer of 1649, Mateo Aguado traveled to the town of Denia on Spain's Mediterranean coast to greet his new queen. The tailor took garment bags filled with new dresses so that Mariana would appear properly dressed in Spanish style during the final leg of her journey to the royal court in Madrid. Before Mariana had left Austria for Spain, Aguado's colleague, who made royal hoop skirts, had sent her the huge hooped undergarment called a guarda infante that was such a distinctive feature of Spanish royal fashion, presumably so she could practice wearing it, which was no easy feat. Aguado dressed Mariana for her processional entry into Madrid, where the new queen was seen by her subjects for the first time. Anyone who missed out on seeing the queen in person could still get a look at the fabulous dress that Aguado had made for her to wear in the procession. A copy of the dress was placed on a life-size sculpture of the queen that was displayed in front of a church in the city center. After Mariana's arrival, the 1650s were the busiest and most creative decade of Mateo Aguado's career. This was also Diego Velázquez's most prolific decade of painting royal portraits, which capture the iconic style that Aguado designed. The distinctive silhouette of the era is expressed most perfectly in Velázquez's portrait of Queen Mariana wearing a black dress decorated with heavy silver trim. Aguado's accounts reveal that the queen hardly ever actually dressed in black. She preferred lighter, brighter colors, such as sky blue, lemon yellow, and grass green. This black and silver ensemble is unusually somber, which was appropriate for a serious state portrait. Documents at the archive of the Royal Palace reveal the secrets of how a dress like this was made and what lay beneath the surface. First of all, such a dress required about 18 yards of rich woven silk. This is about what it takes to upholster a standard sofa today. Beneath the fashion fabric, there were many yards of sturdy textiles like buckram and canvas, rough fabrics made from linen and cotton that stiffened the garment, reinforced pressure points, and shaped the hem. The innermost layer of a dress was a lining made from a crisp silk taffeta. Beneath her dress, the queen wore shaping garments that created the exaggerated proportions that we see in Velázquez's portrait. A corset ribbed with whalebone flattened the queen's chest and compressed her waist, while a hoop skirt made from wire rings gave her lower half that bell-like shape. These undergarments and the layers of petticoats that the queen wore beneath her skirt were usually made from pink or red silk. Pink and red were the colors of flesh and blood, and it was widely believed that they had health-giving properties when worn close to the body. This was especially important for a queen, more than any other woman, for a queen's primary function was to produce a healthy male heir to the crown. In 1657, after much anticipation, Queen Mariana finally gave birth to a baby boy, who was given the name Philip Prosper. Here you see the young boy dressed in healthy red, wearing amulets on a belt around his waist to protect him from the evil eye. Now that King Philip IV had a son to inherit the throne, he turned his attention to arranging a marriage between the Infanta Maria Teresa, his older daughter by Isabel of Bourbon, and the French king Louis XIV. This marriage, if it came to pass, would end the 25-year war between Spain and France. Mateo Aguado dressed Maria Teresa at every step of the marriage negotiations. The colors and decorations of her dresses communicated for the bride-to-be, who had no speaking role as her fate was decided by the men around her. At Philip Prosper's baptism, Maria Teresa wore a special dress that Aguado made from a red and white striped fabric that symbolized the union of the red rose of Castile and the white fleur-de-lis of France. Once Maria Teresa's marriage to Louis XIV had been successfully negotiated, Aguado began to alter her dresses, making the skirts longer so that she could wear them with chapines, which were tall platform shoes that symbolized a married woman's elevated status. When a representative from the French court came to Madrid to finalize the marriage arrangements, Aguado made the Infanta a dress decorated with satin bands pricked with a pattern of olive leaves, symbol of peace and friendship. Mateo Aguado and his colleagues at the Madrid court worked at a frantic pace to make a trousseau of dresses for Maria Teresa to take with her to the border between Spain and France in the summer of 1660. The glittering gowns that Aguado made for the Infanta's trousseau were celebrated in the Spanish press for their extraordinary craftsmanship and good taste, and for their splendid needlework and very expensive decorations. But Aguado's creations were not so well received by the French women in Louis XIV's retinue. One, Madame de Motteville, wrote that the Infanta's clothing was horrible and said that her huge hoop skirt was especially monstrous. The French court artist Charles Lebrun emphasized the size of the Spanish Infanta's hoop skirt in his famous tapestry design commemorating the signing of the peace treaty between Spain and France. Lebrun wasn't there himself, and this isn't an accurate depiction of the dress that the Infanta actually wore, which was one of Aguado's creations, embroidered with diplomatic fleurs-de-lis. Maria Teresa gave up her Spanish hoop skirts to dress in the French style after her wedding to for her wedding to Louis XIV, and she continued to dress in French for the rest of her life. We don't know what happened to all the dresses that Aguado made for Maria Teresa's trousseau. Maybe she gave them as gifts to her Spanish ladies-in-waiting, or perhaps she donated them to sculptures of the Virgin Mary. Or maybe Maria Teresa kept the dresses, stored in their specially made trunks at Versailles, only for them to be destroyed during the French Revolution. In any event, Aguado's dresses were not meant to become heirlooms or museum pieces. They had served an urgent political purpose at a very specific moment in time, and they had done their job well, playing a part in bringing peace after 25 years of war. Now from here, I'd like to turn from Aguado's work at the court to his family life at home. We don't have any painted portraits of Aguado. There are very few images of Spanish court artisans at all, with a rare exception being this family portrait painted by the artist Juan Bautista Martínez del Mazo. This intimate scene can help us imagine Mateo Aguado's family in the 1660s as we build a picture of the tailor's personal life through the documents that he left behind. In December of 1660, Aguado drew up a new will and testament. The tailor at the time was 55 years old, and he declared himself to be in good health. He expressed great satisfaction with his wife of 28 years, Bernarda Ruiz, and praised her great Christianity, truth and judgment, and intelligence. Bernarda was the daughter of King Philip IV's hatmaker. She and Aguado had at least 15 children together, but only 3 lived to adulthood. The eldest and the only boy was Nicolas. When Aguado wrote his will, Nicolas was 25 years old, recently married, and gainfully employed as an accountant in the king's household. We can picture Nicolas Aguado dressed like the elder sons on the left-hand side of this family portrait. Mateo Aguado and Bernarda Ruiz also had 2 young daughters, Maria and Monica, who were 3 and 6 years old. Aguado had every reason to be optimistic about his family's future when he signed his last will and testament on December 20th of 1660. He had his health, a good marriage, a lucrative career, and a son who was poised to elevate the next generation of Aguados into the white-collar bureaucracy of the court. But 18 days later, Nicolas Aguado died, and everything began to fall apart. Nicolas's widow gave birth to a son 6 months later, and then she died, leaving the orphan in the care of his grandfather, Mateo Aguado. A few months later, the grieving tailor committed a grave error on the job. The details are fuzzy, but Aguado somehow offended his aristocratic boss, the keeper of the Queen's wardrobe. The tailor's offense is described as desatención, which suggests that he committed some sort of discourtesy. After 3 decades of service to the crown, Aguado was fired. The document seen here lists the men who served as the Queen's tailor, and there's a note in the margin with an order to erase Mateo Aguado's name from the record. Aguado wasn't just fired, he was sent to prison, the court prison, which is the building seen here. And it looks quite fabulous, but all accounts state that the cells were actually quite dungeon-like and dark. Aguado's punishment, though, was short-lived. Just 2 months later, he was reinstated as the Queen's tailor. But the glory days of his career were now behind him. Aguado struggled financially after he resumed his post at court. Things got especially bad after Philip IV died in 1665, and Queen Mariana began to dress as a widow in boring black and white. Aguado's reign of invention was over. The Queen's tailor spent his final years trying to secure the futures of his 2 daughters, one of whom married an official who worked for the King's Secretary of State. Aguado's daughter was only 12 years old at the time of her marriage, which I think reflects the tailor's urgency to find a foothold in the court bureaucracy after the premature death of his son. Mateo Aguado died on the 5th of November in the year 1672. He had served as tailor to the Queens of Spain for over 42 years. Aguado's widow and his son-in-law undertook an inventory of the possessions that the tailor had left behind: his real estate, furniture and household linens, silver and jewelry, tapestries and rugs, books and paintings. Their careful documentation of the tailor's belongings makes it possible to reconstruct Aguado's home and get to know his personal life and personality a little bit better. We find that Aguado had lived in a spacious house of over 3,000 square feet in a highly desirable location right behind the Plaza Mayor. This is the site of Aguado's home, the corner plot with an acute angle at the junction of the Calle Mayor and Calle Bordadores. For those of you who know Madrid, you'll recognize the building that stands there today. When Aguado lived on this site, the royal coat of arms hung above his front door by permission of the crown. The interior of Aguado's house was very comfortably furnished. He had everything you'd expect to find in an upper-class home in late 17th century Madrid, including all the furnishings and decorations that we can see in this etching: desks, chairs, curtains, framed mirrors, decorative objects, and paintings of various sizes. Aguado owned a collection of 59 paintings. About a third of them were religious images, but there were also landscapes, floral still lifes, one mythological scene, and portraits. The latter included full-length portraits of King Philip IV, Queen Isabella Bourbon, Prince Baltasar Carlos, and the Infanta Maria Teresa, perhaps similar to the one seen here. Royal portraits like these were common in upper-class homes, where they showed the owner's status and loyalty to the crown. In Aguado's house, these paintings meant even more. The tailor had dressed every one of these royal persons, every one of them now dead or gone, and the royal portraits in Aguado's collection probably featured clothing designed by his own hand. Mateo Aguado had a modest library of 60 books, all of them in Spanish, perhaps kept in a bookcase like this. Aguado's library included mystical religious works by Teresa of Avila and Luis de Granada, and contemporary fiction by Cervantes and Quevedo. There were books about Spanish history, but there was nothing foreign, nothing about the wider world. All of the evidence suggests that Mateo Aguado was a devout man, that he was a reader, and that he was highly engaged in contemporary politics and literature, but that his interests didn't extend beyond the court in Madrid. It's fascinating to learn what the Queen's tailor wore himself from the inventory of Aguado's wardrobe. The clothes that the tailor and his family owned were worth more than all his other movable goods combined. The single most valuable garment was a yellow suit of livery that Aguado had received as an honor from Queen Isabel shortly before her death. And here you can see men in yellow livery, presumably like Aguado's, in the background of this view of the Plaza Mayor. Mateo Aguado's yellow livery showed the extraordinary favor that he had acquired in his years of service at the court. But the privileges that Aguado enjoyed paled in comparison to those that Philip IV lavished on Diego Velázquez, the king's favorite painter. Towards the end of his life, Velázquez achieved the ultimate honor when he was admitted into the Noble Order of Santiago, whose red insignia was added to the painter's self-portrait in Las Meninas after his death. The ascent of Velázquez into the ranks of the nobility was truly extraordinary. Mateo Aguado's relatively modest rise is a much more typical story. Aguado's story brings to the fore a social group that's been neglected in Spanish historical studies, the royal artisans who occupied a special place in Madrid's social system between city and court. This is an area of research that for a long time had fallen through the cracks, but is now bustling with new work by young Spanish scholars in the archives. Investigating the work of Madrid's court artisans also reveals new information about well-studied subjects, and the documents debunk conventional wisdom about a number of topics. For example, Aguado's accounts clearly and definitively reveal that queens did not wear hoop skirts when they were pregnant, despite the long-standing myth that these undergarments had been invented to conceal pregnancies. The accounts also prove that dresses donated to devotional sculptures of the Virgin Mary were almost always made new, not recycled from the queen's wardrobe, contrary to conventional wisdom. Looking at the bigger picture, we learn how royal clothing was used as a political tool in very specific ways, with dresses communicating messages through their decorations. One unexpected discovery is the tantalizing evidence that numerous court portraits seem to commemorate expensive gifts of special fabrics, which offers a new way of interpreting these paintings. Careful examination of the court artisans' records also brings new insights into Velázquez's techniques for depicting dress. We learn that he was always working with the styles of any given moment, but he eliminated and elided details of dress for the sake of his compositions. The clothing worn at court, in other words, was even more heavily decorated and complicated than what Velázquez showed us. For all that has been learned, much remains opaque. The lives of the artisans who held top-ranked positions at court can be reconstructed in remarkable detail. But what about the much larger group of artisans who worked underneath them? The lives and contributions of those men, women, and children, probably including unfree laborers, are not documented in the sources at the royal palace and remain another layer yet to be excavated. But Mateo Aguado, who was lost from historical memory for 350 years, has been rescued from obscurity. I would absolutely make the case that his name should be included among the major figures who shaped Golden Age Spanish culture, along with the kings and their ministers, painters and writers who are so well known. Aguado's influence continues to be felt today. The iconic silhouette that he invented has become the symbol of Spanish fashion, the mascot of 21st century Madrid. In fact, last Christmas, this gigantic menina was installed on Madrid's Paseo del Prado, an oversized, if unintended, tribute to the legacy of Mateo Aguado. And Aguado's work continues to influence designers today, whether they know it or not. This November, as Claire mentioned, Spanish Vogue includes a feature about the runway shows for the next season, declaring, quote, Diego Velázquez already portrayed the trends for spring-summer 2026. The story includes this mood board connecting the dots between Velázquez's portraits and the latest runway looks. Now, I have to admit, I was skeptical when I first saw the article, but it really is uncanny. Not just the extended hips, but the shoulder wings with short and the jackets with short skirts and superfluous sleeves. These were all at the height of fashion in Aguado's time. But to me, what's really exciting about this article is that it doesn't just cite Velázquez as the inspiration. The author, Nuria Luis, also gives credit to the tailor, Mateo Aguado, for his work. I wrote in the introduction to my book that its goal was to put the tailor back in the picture. So I couldn't be happier to see Mateo Aguado's name in Vogue magazine. Finally. I'd like to conclude by inviting all of you to continue exploring this fascinating world of early modern Spanish fashion at the Hispanic Society on Broadway and West 155th Street. The exhibition, Spanish Style, Fashion Illuminated, will be on display until March of next year. I had the great privilege of spending the past year curating the exhibition using the Hispanic Society's incredibly rich collections of paintings, sculptures, textiles, jewelry, and illuminated manuscripts. The exhibit shows how men and women outside of the royal court used their clothes as a tool for social advancement in the age of the Spanish Empire. Now that you know all there is to know about Mateo Aguado, if you come to the exhibition, you'll be able to place his story in the longer history of Spanish fashion, and you'll see at least one portrait of a queen dressed in Aguado's creations. And who knows, you might even find some inspiration for your own wardrobes. Thank you very much. Thank you. And I welcome questions if people would like to come up to the microphones.
Would you give us an idea of what was the buildup then to produce these immense skirts? What preceded it?
Like what goes into the skirts? Absolutely.
No, the style. Where did it? What was it before that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Yes, that's a great question. So what comes before? How do we get to this extreme point, right? Spanish fashion, actually you can see in the very background of this, on the far right, the painting of the woman in the red dress. Her lower half looks like a cone, right? Looks like a triangle. That was a Spanish style of what's called a farthingale, or a hooped underskirt, that was invented in the 1490s at the Spanish court and remained in courtly use for an incredibly long time. They were still being used up to the 1650s when they definitively fell out of favor. It was around the 1630s that you start to see the marriage of this cone-shaped structure, which was an underskirt with hoops sewn into it, with some kind of hip extension. And it is thought that that hip extension came from the French style of this, what's called a wheel-shaped farthingale. You might be able to call to mind images of Queen Elizabeth I of England, who wore that style, which came straight out around the waist. And so you kind of combine this sort of like rigid, straight farthingale that extends the skirt with an extension of the hip, and that's how you end up with this, according to the French women in Louis XIV's court, monstrous creation, right? That builds out, combining sort of all the different styles of skirt extensions into one.
Thank you, Amanda. This has just been so enlightening and so much fun. I've heard references to the fact that the over-accentuation of the hips had to do with stressing the fertility of a woman. Is that true? And what other symbolism can you tell us about the Spanish style? Thank you.
Thank you so much. So this is such an interesting and tricky issue that you raise, I think, in terms of, like, what did this mean and what was the symbolism? Because there was all of this criticism from the 1630s onward that women were using these extended skirts with these big hips to hide pregnancies. Now, that's patently absurd because they were worn with these very narrow corsets. And things were different in the 17th century, but women still didn't carry pregnancies in their hips, right? So there's no way that this was hiding a pregnancy. But it was associated with that because that was the criticism at the time. And there are countless examples of plays and short stories and poems that refer to this. There were also all these crazy stories about women hiding things under their skirts. There was my absolute favorite is a report that there was a man in prison and his wife came to visit him wearing a big hoop skirt, hiding escape tools, including a ladder underneath her skirt, so he was able to break out. So basically, when you ask about the symbolism of these skirts, they came to be associated with women doing illicit things, hiding things, getting away with things, and so they were quite controversial. And I mean, they vary. They literally have women are just taking up a lot of space right? So had criticism just heaped on them. They were actually outlawed by King Philip IV in 1639, and there was a very brief period when that law against them was enforced, but Philip IV's wives continued to wear the skirt, and so everybody else did. So it's a very conflicting, complicated garment, and that association with pregnancy is fallacious, but it does seem to have it certainly was something that was in the discourse around these garments in the 17th century up to the present day.
I have a two-part question.
Sure.
So a follow-up to the skirts, is there any indication that because of the cost of the fabric that it was a sign of wealth and potentially, as you're speaking of sort of political symbolism or whatever, that the fact that it was fashionable in Spain, particularly, that it was a sign of sort of the wealth of the country, or the comparative wealth of the aristocracy. Mm-hmm. So that's part one. And then part two is that, I apologize that I walked in a little bit late, but is there any evidence that Aguado and Velázquez actually interacted with each other and knew each other?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So in terms of, yes, the amount of fabric that it took to cover up these skirts, it took a vast quantities of fabric, absolutely huge amounts of fabric. And this was, in fact, one of the criticisms against them was that it was this waste. And of course, as in the realm of conspicuous consumption, this is one of the things that made them so valuable to the people who wore them, because it clearly showed off. And it's not just the fabric, but the trimming, right? So that portrait of Queen Mariana of Austria in the black with the silver, that thick braid around the hem, well, you can count, there's 8 rows of that. And that trimming cost more than the black velvet did. It's made of real silver. And so the number of rows of trim you have around that huge circumference is also going to be showing off your wealth. So it's an incredibly potent tool for showing off wealth, right? And then thank you so much for that question about, is there any evidence of Velázquez and Aguado interacting? I have not found that piece of paper. I desperately hope somebody does someday. They absolutely had to cross paths. They were in the same milieu for decades. They were both serving the same purpose. Here are two men at the height of their professions, in the top field, in the top position at the court, doing the job of presenting the image of the royal family. So there's no way they didn't know each other. But I haven't seen their names on the same sheet of paper yet.
Thank you very much. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
You said that Maria Teresa gave up her Spanish outfits when she married Louis XIV. But French court dress was pretty outrageous at the time, too. How was it any different?
Thank you. I think to our eyes today, it all just looks so wild, but there were big differences. French dress was much more low cut. It showed décolletage, which was seen as, in Spain at this time, the one Jesuit writer wrote that if two fingers below the neckline was a mortal sin. Okay, so what was happening in France was truly off the scale. So the low cut necklines, and then there are some subtle differences which certainly are not apparent to our eye. Like in Spain, you wore a corset underneath your exterior garment. In France, you wore a boned bodice. And so that was just, so there are some differences like that. But one of the most important differences was that the French had stopped wearing hoop skirts and farthingales decades ago. Those were completely out of fashion and had been for a very long time. And so you did have a much more natural dress line to the skirt. And also there were differences of hair and makeup. I mean, women at the Spanish court it was always being commented by foreigners who came to Madrid how women in Madrid wore these, were a ton of makeup. And so the French look was much more naturally styled than the Spanish. So lots of differences at the time, which to someone at the moment were really seen as symbols of differences in national character.
Back again.
Yes, great.
So first I want to make a comment about the two-finger observation. I have a friend who got married, a Spaniard, in the late 80s, and she had a slightly off the shoulder, not even, strapless. It was like out to here. And at the last minute, she had to borrow a friend's shawl to put over her wedding dress because she was warned as she was getting ready to process up to the altar that the priest turned away a bride because she was showing too much of her figure. So
That is just like the Archbishop of Saragossa in 1668, who threatened to excommunicate any woman who came to church dressed like that. That is fantastic.
but that's like the 1980s for you.
That's great.
This was post-Franco, is when there was this whole aperture of Spanish culture. Anyway, just an aside for people to know that plus ça change, s'il plaît la même chose. My question has to do with all the ornamentation, and particularly the jewels and the silver and gold threads. You talk a lot about repurposing fabrics. You would also, I think, want to recover the pearls and the jewels that were encrusted. So we know the Spanish crown was quite wealthy because of having their empires far-flung across the globe. But where were these jewels ending up after they were repurposing dresses? And what do we know about that?
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So the most evidence I have on that actually comes from the children's clothing. And I saw explicit references in the documents to when the little royal children outgrew or soiled their clothes, that the really rich trimmings would be removed and put on something else. So they were certainly reused, absolutely.
Thank you. I was struck by your comment that Aguado kept drawings and did drawings and
yes.
notebooks, because you often hear that Spanish painters of the time did not do a lot of drawing, that is sort of unique to Spain. And I'm wondering, do the drawings, do those survive?
Sorry, which ones?
The Aguado's drawings.
Yes, thank you so much. No. Of course, my dream is that they're going to turn up somewhere between the pages of something in the archives. But the truth is, my guess is that they don't survive because they weren't made to survive. I think that most likely they were probably used up. They would have gone probably from Aguado to the embroiderer at the court, and he probably would have used them as a template. It was the embroiderer who made the decorations that Aguado designed, and so they probably would have just been used up in the embroiderer's workshop and tossed once they had served their purpose. That's my guess. I think there are a few really wonderful tailor's drawings from Italy. They're quite crude, but they show basically like an outline of a cape and with little notes saying what color the cape, the wool would be and what color the trim would be. My impression from reading the documents is that Aguado's drawings were really drawings of dress decorations, and specifically of those button and loop decorations, which look to us kind of like paisleys. And Aguado made them in many different kinds of shapes. There were carnations, there were clubs, there were palm leaves. And so I think that these probably were quite detailed drawings to the scale that would have been used to actually embroider the decorations. I can tell you, I was so excited when I discovered those in the documents because, this idea of drawing being such an important part of what distinguishes the liberal arts from other kinds of the art from other kinds of crafts. It was a really important debate at the time. But most of all, it just really shows that Aguado was creating and inventing things, and his predecessor was not paid for making drawings. So I think this was something new.
You mentioned Aguado had a 42-year career at the court.
Yes.
Is that an exceptionally long career? Was he competing for priority, let's say, with other tailors at the time?
Right, thank you so much. This was pretty standard. Once you got one of these jobs, you held on to it. It's like being a full professor, right? And there could only be one, you could only have one head tailor. There was the queen's and the king's households were separate, so you had one for the king, one for the queen, and you basically had to wait for that guy to die and hope he didn't have any children if you wanted to take his place, because very often the position would be passed along to the son, and if there wasn't a son of age to take the job, that's when, very interestingly, sometimes the wives of these artisans would take over and hold those positions. So for example, Philip IV's embroiderer for some time was a woman named Sebastiana de Palacios who had inherited the job from her father, and she was a placeholder, but she was the one doing the job for quite some time. So this whole world of court artisans and how they got their positions and passed them along, I think it's a really interesting one.
In your book, do you go over anything about men's fashion, peacocks of the time, plus the interplay of armor and the clothes that had to match them, and the complementing of the different kinds of styles on that?
Right.
Swashbuckling, this, that.
Right. Thank you so much. The topic of armor and fashion, I think, is absolutely fascinating. I got to dive into that a little bit because of the influence that it had on women's fashions. I did focus mostly on the women's fashions because it was focused on the tailor to the queens. But they were pretty wild. But interestingly, Aguado did make occasional gifts of clothing for the king from the queen. He dressed the royal princes. He made, also one of his big tasks was he had to dress all the members of the queen's household, so male and female, and they would receive as a privilege of their position a gift of clothing once a year. So he did make clothing for men as well as for women. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get into the swashbuckling style, as you call it, as much as I would have liked. Right. Well, thank you all so very much for your attention. It was great to see you.